Hey everybody, welcome back to Strangleholds on America. This is your co-host number 1 and number 2, Liam.
And this is Michael, and this is our first episode in, 6 months or something?
I think it has been a while.
It's been quite an eventful while.
Eventful while with a lot more reading, a lot more depth, and hopefully with better sources and a better understanding. A few coups under our belt here in the U.S.
A lot has happened in politics and in the world. So, yeah, we're just going to give a little bit of intro here. This is our show, Strangleholds on America, where me and Liam do deep dives into specific political topics or just topics within the U.S. that we feel we'd like to know more about or we'd like to kind of develop a conversation around, and we present them to you guys in these podcast formats.
Yeah, the whole goal really is to inform people so they can make up their own minds on these type of topics and to help them understand the world they live in, as well as like the whole everything is propaganda, like from a base level maybe. I don't know. It's just we're getting at it all. Eventually we'll cover that all.
Yeah. And I mean, I think our biggest thing, or at least one of the things we talked about a lot before starting and while starting this, was that we wanted to just make this a dialogue and make this something that people can listen to, and this isn't the end all be all. We're just giving you guys a little bit of information, and hopefully you can take this and do what you will. But again, we're not trying to force things on you or say this is the one and only way it has to be, or like our past episodes, for example, like this isn't the one way that America has to be run or one way the voting system is. And so that kind of brings us to our topic today, where we were interested in understanding a little bit more about terrorism.
So when we think about terrorism, we normally imagine people just being called terrorists and then the United States government like responding to that. Them saying that they've taken them out. You're thinking drone strikes. You're thinking maybe people in Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah.
But in reality, a terrorist is just someone who uses the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims, based off of Oxford languages. Mm-hmm. And the focus of today's episode is really defining what that actually is. So when we look at terrorism, specifically here in the United States, it's very focused on our perspective through the world. As Noam Chomsky puts it, if for a moment we can adopt the perspective of the world, we might ask which criminals are wanted the world over. Basically, what we're trying to point out here is from the perspective of the world, terrorism isn't uniform. Mm-hmm. It is normally specific groups against other groups, whether they be country on country, a specific religious group against a country against a religious group.
Yeah.
Really, the idea of the most wanted man, the big terrorist, doesn't exist, and it's only in specific countries. And what's really important to point out here is that a lot of other countries don't really comment on this type of thing, in the sense that if the U.S. goes in to assassinate a terrorist, with quotation marks here, they don't really step out of the way because the reputation damage they would be taking, and going against the soft and hard power of the United States to stop that would be very difficult.
Yeah, it's a very egocentric way of looking at it. I mean, you think about like the news and how they portray terrorism or what terrorists are, and it's always like, obviously you think 9/11, you think of like people like religious fanatics or people who are trying to cause harm on a large scale and incite violence and terror, and a lot of it is like bringing attention to a specific cause or idea. And so in our perspective in America, we look at that as anything happening against Americans is a terrorist act, right? And I think that's the point Chomsky's making in that quote, is him saying like, if we can look outside of ourselves and look at the world, look as just as a population on the world, you can see that terrorists are going to be different all over the place, and it's going to be really specific to kind of who's being attacked. It's not like, who's wanted the world over, I think is the point he's making there, is that a lot of the atrocities that America is purported on making would be kind of thought in that terroristic act. But again, we're looking at it in the context of how are Americans being affected. It's like a very, very in ourselves perspective.
Later, we'll be getting into American terrorism acts, but for now, we're basically just saying terrorism is subjective. We're starting to add a little bit of ambiguity to the term.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. Definitely is. And I think that's something that in like 2004, you look at like the war on terror, and like that was kind of, they were trying to reduce that ambiguity. They were trying to say that there is a way we can exterminate all terrorists, or that terror was an idea. It wasn't like that it was this one group, and that we could fight them and we could win somehow.
Well, I mean, once we defeat the King of Terror, everything will work out.
I mean, I guess so. It's just, it's a very...
You can never have an end to a term or a definition.
No, yeah, no.
You can never have a war with something that encapsulates every idea that is against a national interest. And it is a waste of our time and very literally costs us many American lives trying to deal with that. Yeah. Because if the State Department can declare people terrorists almost whenever they want,
pretty much
it makes it impossible to end that type of war because they'll just continuously pop up. And that's not even fully differentiating domestic terrorists from international terrorists.
Yeah, that's a whole nother ballgame. Yeah, exactly. So I guess after that, we want to look a little bit more at so this is a section that I kind of pioneered, and in talking about this episode and in thinking about where we want to take this, I really wanted to understand more about how terrorism began and when was terrorism, I guess, first conceived as an idea, or like, has it always been a thing? I think we're so focused on terrorism as this one thing, like we were saying, the war on terror. This is an American perspective, so I wanted to kind of get an idea of what, more broadly speaking, terror would be.
Yeah,
so,
especially because when we think terrorism, it's more normally in the modern day. It's rarely ever like
how it developed.
Where did it develop?
Yeah.
Is there terrorist acts before like 9/11?
Exactly. I think a lot of people forget about it. And I think that's another thing. Like, terrorism can have such a strong power in that it's such an exigent thing. Like, if an event happens and there's this huge terrorist act, it foreshadows so much that happened in the past. Like, you think 9/11, it's like the end-all, be-all of terrorist acts. And everything that preceded it is kind of just like, pales in comparison, essentially.
When in reality, I would argue none of it would have happened had we not made mistakes that go as far back as World War I with how we carved up the Middle East. Yeah. It's just, all of these acts have very, very clear lines from history, very clear points, very clear actions that led to reactions. Mm-hmm. And if we don't get into the history of that, if we don't really understand why people made the decisions they did, why America even became a symbol for jihad, to jihad against. Then it just makes it so that these are one-off events that can easily be changed into whatever perspective people want, from right-wing to left-wing pushes.
And I think that was the whole war on terror, was them being like, lambasting it and labeling it as this is what it is, and this is how we're going to beat it, I think it kind of, it, like you said, it plays into a lot of that. So we went into kind of the dictionary definition, and I just wanted to say that dictionary definition has been, I know that within America, they I think it was like 18 or something different types of definitions for terrorism. Like,
at a minimum.
Yeah, they just keep changing it, or they keep readopting it, or adding new things to it. So,
and then depending on different contexts, it's used in different ways.
Yeah, or like the difference between terrorism and terror, and then there's a whole kind of gray area that I think a lot of people think that they can use these things interchangeably, but really there's specific differences, and we'll get into that historically. So I just wanted to start off and look at kind of where terrorism started, and also talk a little bit about how, like, some of its characteristics. So this is kind of a description by Paul R. Pillar, and he's like a scholar within the field of terrorism, and he writes a lot on that. And he says that oftentimes terrorism is understood in conjunction with a political dimension. So, like we said, it is a political...
It's in pursuit of political aims.
Yeah, like we said. And that, in many ways, terrorism is insolvable. It's an age-old practice of both state and non-state sponsored groups, and it can reach many different targets, and often in the aim of political gain. So you think about it, like, it's such a huge thing. There's so many different ways that it can happen, and there's so many different reasons that it can be caused for. And then it's like, how can we solve that, or what, where does that start?
digging a tiny bit into that, when he says terrorism is insolvable, I find that to be the most interesting part of that quote, because he's both totally correct and at the same time I so totally want to go against it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we, by having actions, by having interests as a country, we will inevitably get into conflict with other countries. And depending on how those conflicts escalate, how they change, it's possible that terrorism will be a result. It may, obviously, a more extreme one.
Yeah.
But it scares me to think that even if we do everything perfectly, it's very possible that other countries will put either the U.S. or specific religious groups or whatever group that they target as an outsider, as like a lesser man, as a scapegoat to solve their own problems, in which it might not even be the fault of that group. I'm thinking more specifically Jews for Nazi Germany, think Mexicans for the United States, where even though they haven't done a whole lot to deserve the amount of hatred that is being pointed towards them, they in no way specifically pushed for it, it's still being used as a scapegoat, still being used as like a system to deal with internal problems or to gain internal power.
No, I think, and that's like, you think of like what the terrorism really means, and like how it kind of motivates and can shift kind of these eyes and these ideas of what is going on. Like, I think at its very raw form, the idea of terrorism and what it can do is such a motivating factor, because it's so scary for a lot of, it can cause so much disruption just within, whatever may be happening. But let's just say, like, you look at 9/11, you look at like how much of change that had on like all facets of our life.
Yeah.
And then you think like that was just kind of this one-off act, and it just kind of, but it didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't just like something that, happened. It was, like you said, it had very clear historical context, but at the same time, these things can happen kind of not arbitrarily, but on their own. Like, they build within themselves. Like you were saying, groups can use those ideas or these out-groups and force their ideas against them, and then the terrorist acts are those that are caused against those people.
Yeah, even if the out-groups themselves may have had nothing to do with an original message.
Yeah. You think of it like that. It's, and that's kind of a different way of looking at it, and it's an interesting perspective.
Honestly, it's a little bit of a downer perspective.
It is sad. I mean, it is sad, but again, I think the more that we talk about this and the more that we realize that it's not going away, the better we can combat it, if that makes sense.
Because if we can at least look a few years in the future, try to get some perspective on what our actions might cause, I feel like it makes it a lot easier to stop the cycle. Because if we can look back and try to pinpoint where it started, we can hopefully at least minimize.
Or just have those things in mind when you're doing something. Like you said, like, well, what are the repercussions five years from now? Like what really is going to be affected by these changes? Yeah. And so, I mean... Amen! Yeah. Okay, so going back to the historical context, I wanted to explain a little bit about the kind of... And obviously this isn't the first terrorist group, or these aren't the first ones to do it. But historically, or like popularly, there's this group named the Assassins, and it's an 11th century offshoot of a Shia Muslim sect. And so they were just very zealous, they were very religious, and what they would do is they would stab their victims, and these victims a lot of the times were politicians or clerics, and those are the people who would kind of refuse their religious perspective, or they thought that they were going not far enough in the eyes of Islam or in the eyes of what their religion was telling them, and that they were kind of diluting it. So these assassins, the Shia Muslim sect, would then assassinate them in broad daylight with weapons, stabbing them or what it may be. So you look at that and you think, it kind of makes sense. I mean, okay, that's a terrorist act. It's these assassins going around for a religious end to kill these politicians that they think are, betraying them. And that's like you were saying, like they kind of create these enemies of themselves and then target them. And so this is kind of, I think, in my mind, where a lot of terrorism comes from. It's a connection between religion and these religious fervents, and then the people who are then motivated to carry out these violent, political acts of violence. And it's political because obviously they're trying to get their laws or ideas passed.
Yeah, because ultimately they are making a statement.
Yeah.
by bringing blood into the discourse of politics, they are bringing a statement, even if it's just something small, saying that they are willing to go to the extreme of killing other people rather than trying to combat and defeat their ideas.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like a very kind of one-sided view of like we can enact change only through violence, and it kind of again hits back to what I was saying, where at its very core it can be such a volatile and I don't want to say beneficial, but it can really cause some real change, for the better or worse. But like that violence, it can be such a means for change is kind of interesting to think about, and I think a lot of people don't really consider it. Okay, so continuing on, that's just kind of an explanation of a very early on terrorist group, or what a lot of historians like to think of as the first terrorists.
Really, that's old group. Very old
11th
group.
century. Yeah, and again, they were very religious. And then this also connects kind of to modern times, because the people who would perpetuate or who would do these attacks believe that their deaths would be sacrificial, and thus that they would be guaranteed to be, when they die, they'd be in paradise. And that's kind of the idea of, like, I think it's 72 virgins or something in Islam, that if a martyr goes against, or if somebody goes against martyrs and kills them or whatever in the name of Islam, they'll be given 72 virgins in heaven when they die.
I can't tell you that story. I'm not.
I don't know.
I'm
it's
not up to date enough.
Yeah, I mean, but you look at now and you look at like kind of current times, and you see that kind of again the same trend is perpetuated, that a religious aim would be fulfilled by them committing these acts, and I think that's really scary, and I think that's awful. But then you're going to see that a lot more of this is like state sponsored, and the religious aspect kind of plays into it, but at the same time, there's a whole lot more that goes behind it.
Yeah. Once we get to modern day, it becomes much more complicated. I think the most interesting part of this is how these people are pushing for their religious beliefs to be accepted by more, or at least their interpretation.
Yeah.
And so I don't fully understand from where I sit why that would help. Because if you're pushing for people to accept your ideas, if you're pushing for people to fully believe in whatever religious perspective that you have, why would killing the opposition do anything other than generate fear, animosity, rather than actually helping get more people converted to your ideals?
Yeah.
And while obviously anybody who doesn't want to kill someone would probably agree with that.
I hope so.
Maybe. But it's disturbing that some people get that backed into a corner where they feel that is
That's
only
the only
option.
option.
And they really so fervently believe in whatever ideas those are that they feel like that is the only way to properly get them past. That they can't have a discussion, they can't push for these ideas, either that or if they have lost at such a level that is their only recourse.
I think historically you look at it, and I think it definitely stems a lot from them losing. It's a lot of they're so backed in a corner they have no other option. Politically they're failing, or on a large scale probably they had very little followers. The group was probably very small in comparison to the rest of the population.
Gotcha.
And then you think of how much power that yields when then they can just kind of exert their will and do these insane acts, like you said, that many people would see as being against even their religious beliefs, or very regular people would not understand or accept that was something that should happen. And so it kind of creates, in my mind, their willingness to do anything and try these things and attack the very people that they would hope to be on the side of, or at least persuade them to do the things that they wanted. I think it creates a fear very much, and I think that was very intentional, was that very base level fear that think of the politician murdered and then his replacement coming in, he's going to be very weary about going against what these groups might think.
Yeah. Or on the other hand, they could come in
or
now with the support of the public and push the idea that
even
they
further
might
away.
fear.
Yeah.
And so what I'm basically trying to get at here is that when we are in a democracy, a republic, whatever it might be, once we start turning to these terrorist acts, big asterisk on terrorist in this context, but those ideas that rhetoric that is leading people to go to that extreme can be seen in modern day through certain conversations with politicians, through certain suggestions.
Yeah.
And really, what I'm trying to get at the heart of here is that terrorism as a whole isn't just spawned from nothing. And it really, really has to be kept in mind that these people don't turn to this normally.
Yeah, that's exactly a good point. I mean, and then again, it's like they have to have some kind of idea in their mind that pushes them to do that. Like, nobody's going to rationally understand and think like, oh, it's okay for me to kill somebody because they did my order, you know? Or something like, there has to be something bigger, and then at the same time, given like our current standards and like what, you know, our terrorist acts are considered now, like they need to have a lot of, you know, not just political capital, but like they need to have a lot of just money or resources to be able to commit these things.
Definitely makes me want to do an episode on the rhetoric that leads to that.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be really interesting to consider. But so the whole example I was giving there was just kind of to show a very early example of terrorism, as well as to kind of give an idea that it was very a religious-based thing. And that kind of continued. That was a big trend until about the 19th century. Before the 19th century, religion was the only acceptable justification for terror. And then secularization motivations for such actions did not emerge until the French Revolution, as did the first uses of the term now used to describe them. So that was really when terror became a big idea and a big kind of explainer for what was going on. So obviously during the French Revolution, the lower people were just pissed off. They were angry. They started these mobs, these lynch mobs, these people, the guillotine. They were going after the politicians, and it was a whole kind of power dynamic. It was that idea. They were pissed off, forced in a corner. They had nothing left for themselves, so they turned to torture. They turned to terror. They turned to killing their leaders.
Was it Robespierre who was?
Yeah.
Yes. He did do an excellent job there.
Yeah.
He also made a cult himself during the French Revolution, called the Cult of Reason, if I'm remembering correctly.
Cult of Reason, yeah.
Which also helps your point in the sense that they also had that political religious aim during these terrorist acts.
Yeah, but so this was less religious, and this was really the first instance of it being for very political ends.
Gotcha.
Essentially to take power back from the greedy or the people that were currently in power and give it to the people, quote unquote.
The people.
The people.
What an amazing term.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the first real example of terror, and because the whole thing was the reign of terror, was what described the French Revolution. And so that was this idea of, oh, this is a terrorist act. And so, yeah, these ideas are very made clear. A lot of commentators at that time were then linking that to terrorism, and this is when it kind of begins to change. It becomes more of a political, less of a religious feature. And then this is really interesting because around this same time, this is an Italian kind of revolutionary coined the phrase propaganda of the deed. And so in his mind, what that was a terrorist act would be sending a message to an audience outside of the target and would kind of drum up support for it. So we saw this kind of very initially with the first example I gave, where it was the act itself would then be harming the politician, let's just say. But then at the same time, there would be the people outside of that who possibly had some understanding of what was going on and maybe accepted the fact that, oh, I don't like that guy. He's dead. Now it kind of draws support for the idea that they're presenting. So this kind of goes back to not really the rhetoric of how these people understand and accept the terroristic acts, but it's more like the larger reaching public and how the public's opinion of a terrorist act has a lot to do with why the terrorist act is being committed.
It seems like it works extremely effectively as a rallying cry in that case.
Yeah.
Where people see that individual who may have committed the act as a martyr of a sort, or someone to be honored, I think would be revered, rather than for the horrendous act that they committed, which might help them garner the support that they're looking for.
Yeah, and again, I mean,
or help their particular group stand out.
Yeah, and that was definitely this guy was just kind of one who coined that phrase and really expressed how much of an impact these acts can have. And I think another big part of that, the propaganda of the deed, is that it's not just even the support now. I think we look at that now. We look more like current events, and we see it's more like the fear or the anger or the vitriol of like, this act is causing this, and people are feeling this way about it. So it kind of draws public opinion in both ways. It can be in a rallying cry, and it can also be in a rejection or a kind of fear. And I think that's what a lot of people understand terrorism as being now, is like, drawing people to be so afraid of whatever act may be that they kind of have to accept it.
That's a very valid point.
Yeah. Okay, so continuing on, this is just kind of a little explanation of, again, more groups are realizing these ideas and understanding how much of an impact terrorism can have, in that it can, be a rallying cry for both sides. And then 1930s, we see a very different type of terrorism, and it's called state-sponsored terrorism. And
ooh, this is where it gets interesting.
This is where a lot of things, it gets kind of hairy, because the example that they give here was the Serbian government. So the Serbian government and military were involved, and they say unofficially, but they would support, train, and arm various Balkan groups, which would then, those were kind of the ones who were preemptive and caused the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So if you think about that, and you look at, this idea now of the state being involved, and it has this whole new connotation, these whole new ideas. Yeah, I mean...
So when we think of that in modern day, to try to give some reference, India and Pakistan have had a lot of issues.
Yeah,
they, right now, are unofficially funding terrorist groups in each other's country. India doing it for Pakistan, Pakistan doing it for India. Mm-hmm. And so to add a little bit of context, what makes this so hairy is that states have a lot of deniability. They can sponsor something without officially sponsoring it. Yeah. They might know of an attack and just not alert the country.
And it could technically be state-sponsored, yeah.
And so when we think about that, mixed with how these states are trying to work towards their own ends, it really becomes a difficult question to answer, since you have to draw the line of what is a state sponsor, and is there a certain level of state ignorance, and like, what do you expect from a country to do to stop all acts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good idea. That's a very good, I hadn't thought about that, and yeah, like, is a state sponsor someone who like quite literally gives funds and ammunition or what have it to these groups, or are they just oblivious and intentionally not warning other countries that these things are going to happen? I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can look at it, and a lot of different ways that it can be kind of played out. But just, again, that's kind of an example of modern day. We look back historically and we see these are really the first roots of state-sponsored, like really state-sponsored, where they're very intentionally trying to assassinate members of other nations, or afflict change that they couldn't do themselves, so they have to go outside of their borders to do it. So then again, we look back in 1930s, you see there's just even more, political assassinations. You see then again, there's like a backlash. You look at the League of Nations. They tried to have some conventions to prevent and punish terrorism and establish an international criminal court, which in my mind, I had no idea that was an idea back in the 1930s. But
I believe it still exists today. Definitely still exists.
Well, it was not
the League
formed.
of Nations, but the International Criminal
Court.
The
criminal court was not actually formed in the 1930s. They, I think what happened was then, obviously, 1930s, World War II was going on or about to start at that time, and it kind of just pushed all that on the back burner. So it didn't actually start then, but it's interesting to see that terrorism was like a pre-functionary way of getting those ideas and that ball rolling.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then this is kind of a lead back into the idea of what is a governmental and what is non-governmental terrorism. And so there's some debate really about what should be considered, should terrorism be considered non-governmental? And I think a lot of that is kind of this state-sponsored versus terrorism. So there's one thinker here, Jessica Stern, who insists that in deliberately bombarding civilians as a means of attacking enemy morale, states have indeed resorted to terrorism. So again, that's the idea that...
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, yeah, you're fine.
When when we think about terrorism nowadays, it's no longer something that is cheap.
No,
If you're
yeah.
trying to make a statement, you think, and when you're trying to do these type of acts, it involves car bombings. It involves shootings somewhere. It's normally no longer a single undertaking to radicalize someone, to get the message out for people to even know that you exist. And so, no matter what, they need money. And
Yeah.
that money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
And so when she makes the point that states have resorted to terrorism and that pretty much all terrorism has to do with a state in some way, it's basically saying, in a sense, where's the money coming from?
Yeah.
People, where are they hiding out?
Yeah.
Where do they live? Are they safe? Are they fighting back for a certain territory, thinking along the lines of ISIS? People just can't do this type of thing completely in isolation because most modern people don't know how to make a car bomb.
No.
Like, most people don't have the money or resources to get that. And even if you did like have the knowledge and wanted to do some act, at least in the United States, if you ordered all the parts for it, I guarantee you, you would
have
light up
10
on every
FBI agents.
sensor.
Yeah, no. And then another point she's making there is that she's really stressing the idea that the state, or that she's really saying that it doesn't have to be an outside group, and that a lot of it is going to come from within the state. And I think her definition is being so broad as she's kind of explaining how the U.S. has done some actions that people would consider to be terroristic. So you think back in the 1930s and World War II, there's the Allied strategic bombing campaigns. So, when the U.S. would go in and they would bomb very specific, targets. They would bomb cities. They would bomb civilians. They wouldn't focus on military groups, or like the kind of conventions of war that were established before that were kind of thrown out the window. And they were just kind of carpet bombing, doing these attacks on really just anybody. It was very, the ethics of it were very questioned, and even to this day, it's not really a big issue, or I don't think it's I think a lot of people wouldn't consider it to be a problem, but you really, like, that is a terroristic act. It was attacking another state, state funded, and then going after their civilians in a means of causing something to end. In that case, it was the end of the war. And so that whole thing is just to show that would be considered a terroristic act that the U.S. committed. And then you look at things like, the atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's very similar. I mean, those are just mass centers of populations. It's not like they were, specifically creating bombs, or they knew that there was military bases there, which, I mean, there might have been, but...
I think that's complicated, though. Like,
No,
one of the things about terrorist acts on a state level is, especially during a war, is how complicated this becomes. Because when we think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they technically dropped pamphlets warning people that they had the greatest bomb. And some people rightfully didn't believe that.
Yeah.
If I were to show photos of a place that was firebombed and a place that was nuked, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They look so similar.
I mean, it's just destruction.
Yeah, it is just destruction. And so it was also done in order to break the morale of the Japanese. But that's the thing. We're looking back at it now with many, many, many years of propaganda, history being told in a certain way, where it's been justified in whatever way is necessary for the government.
Yeah.
And it's hard for us to see it as the terrorist act that it was at the time. Because even though we did do things to make it morally more righteous, we did eventually nuke them twice. And while you could argue it saved many American lives, that it ended the war faster, like, we'll never know that for 100%
You'll never see the
certainty.
alternative side of, like, what would happen if it hadn't happened.
Yeah, and we'll also never 100% be sure, like, whether or not it was the right decision, or if they could, or more importantly, if we'll ever see how they saw those bombings on a very personal, individual level, unless you specifically look for it.
Yeah. But so, I mean, on a large scale, that was just kind of a way of looking at, just how terrorism has been changing, and how, a lot of these groups don't want terrorism to define what they do. And we're going to go into that later. But I wanted to go back to another point we had been making before. And like you were saying, the idea that these groups are trying to, just say vaguely terrorist groups, like they're trying to commit these things to get attention to whatever ideas or things that they're pushing, right?
Yeah.
And so you look at the globalization of the media, and you see that kind of plays into their ideas. You look at the 1970s, 1960s, they had these kind of huge terror campaigns or these terrorist groups were just kind of committing these insane and crazy acts, and the media was eating it up. I mean, they were, these things were on the news constantly. There was always like a new bombing. There was a new, I think one of the ones that they explain here was the Palestinian PLO. I think it's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and how they hijacked several athletes. I think it was on a bus. It was 11 Israel athletes in the 1972 Olympic Games, and so they were actually they murdered the 11 athletes, and the whole time that they were holding them hostage, the news was there, and they were kind of drawing attention to what was going on, and they were trying to speak out against the Israeli subjugation of the Palestinians, but do the ends suit the means? And it was just kind of showing how much the media is drawing on these ideas and how much the media kind of plays into the terrorist intentions a little way.
Yeah, trying to keep my tangent down to 30 seconds here. How the media plays into this, how it gives it so much attention, how it reads out the manifestos, how it says the terrorist groups' names, how it shows the ideas to the mainstream, even if they're told is crazy, how the media is literally a broadcasting network for these ideas, making them from fringe to well-known. Yeah. It's not healthy.
In any way.
No, and because of that, these groups are more willing to do these acts because they know if they make them gruesome enough, they know if they commit
it kind of
and
guarantees
kill
them
people,
this media attention.
Yeah, if they get this megaphone, if they manage to take responsibility for the act, they will immediately have their message shot out to the world. Yeah. And that's not good. It's very, very scary for people.
It's a very sticky place to be. And it reminds me a lot of, this is very much of a tangent, but the lone shootings and the suspects, and they just display their faces all over the place, and they, I think a lot of people are trying to push back against that, but it's a very similar situation.
Them?
Yeah, at what point are they glorifying them? But so again, we look at 1970s, 1960s, this was kind of the whole, beginning of that whole mass globalization of media. And it was this big opportunity for terrorist groups to commit these insane, crazy acts and get all of this attention and these, eyes on them. So that's just kind of a look at how that has kind of developed. And then you see, in some cases, the mass media attention has brought actual change for these groups. So they cite examples such as Algeria, Cyprus, Kenya, and Israel, where terrorism, arguably pushed these groups' goals and actually realized them. So you kind of see some things actually changing in them actually making an actual impact with these terrorist acts, which is even scary to think about, that the media, not just the media obviously, but that so many other things have kind of enabled this to actually incite change.
Yeah, the reason I'm particularly pegging the media is because if we control the information that is in basically the daily news, and what most people are watching, and we treat it as an attack that we should band together, that we should try to heal over something like this and really solve the root problem, it's a lot better than just putting up the names and faces, saying their manifesto, and explaining why they're doing it, because that's part of the goal. Yeah. And so
we're playing into that.
Yeah. We're lambasting it because it could be handled so much better specifically there. Mm-hmm. And we'll lambast the State Department in 10 minutes.
Yeah. We made very good points. All those are... And I think in a similar way, it's so much easier just to feed off the people's anger and their fear of whatever events have happened, and they can just continuously show these footages of whatever event happening. There's I'm thinking the recent, was it the bombing of was that Christmas Day in Oklahoma?
Yes.
Or was it not Oklahoma? It was
I don't remember.
I don't know. Nearby there was a bombing. I think only the perpetrator was harmed. But I just remember seeing the news, this continual feed of the actual explosion. And it's like, it's so much easier to show the people that and to get people to understand that than it is, like you were saying, to
sit down and say the history of this was caused
Yeah.
by, they were
Or, like-
radicalized because of these ideas,
Yeah, or,
because
like,
of these
how we can-
fundamental problems.
or like how we can come together after that. Like, it's, I think it's kind of the easier route.
Yeah.
Is to do that, obviously. So
Get
that was
some more
like kind
viewing times for the 24-hour news networks.
Yeah. Again, that's a plug for our was it episode 2, manufacturing consent. You
Yes.
guys should check that out. Okay. Anyways, going back.
You should
to
watch
this.
them all 2 or 3 times, in fact.
I don't know about 2 or 3 times. I don't want to subject them to torture now. But anyways, that was kind of 1970s, 1960s, how the media buzz played into a lot of terrorist acts. And then you look at the 1980s, or mid-1980s to be specific, and you see this kind of reemergence of state-sponsored terror. You see the actions of the U.S. in places like the Middle East, with countries like Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, as these new places for state-sponsored terror to grow. They had another enemy, being the U.S. in is that the Gulf Wars and those things.
Yes, it would be the Gulf Wars,
Yeah.
I believe. So when we talk about the United States terrorist acts, specifically after Al-Qaeda attacked America in September 11, 2001, we normally think of it as a retaliation for 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
We think of it as like, we did this because they did that.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about the 1980s, 1990s, we very much came to them long before they came to us, in the very sense that we, specifically with Lebanon, I believe, Lebanon and Israel, what would happen is they would do bombings. America would do bombings on their behalf, or at least be aware of it in most cases, and then never stop it, never move against it.
No.
And so when they would retaliate against Israel, specifically Lebanon, if I'm pretty sure I'm on the money here, we would then do worse acts against them.
Like countermeasures, essentially.
Yeah, because they weren't playing the game, quote unquote.
Yeah. And this is kind of, I think a lot of this goes back to what you were saying. This is like a good example of kind of historical context for where we are now and how these terrorist acts have continued and even in a lot of cases grew, given the fact that we had been in this country back in the 1980s. And so again, you see state-sponsored terror being spawned by actions of countries such as ourselves. And yeah, it was just a new idea and a new way of looking at things. And they had kind of used those same concepts of turning people to be more afraid. You think, like, you look at I think it was the September, they had like a previous World Trade terrorist attack
where they had the bomb
with
at the bottom of the
that
basement.
had messed up or something, and like that,
Or
I think,
it didn't actually collapse it. They just took out, I think,
like some
2
beams,
pillars.
some
Yeah.
support beams.
Support beams.
And the idea was to topple the whole thing. But you look at that, and that kind of fits kind of along with this, where they're trying to play into how America has impacted them, and they're going straight to America to do that to them.
It also really speaks to like the terrorist act itself, like, because it didn't collapse the towers, because a lot of people did not die, it's very much less remembered. It's also overshadowed, but very much less remembered.
Yeah.
And so because of that, it really shows that these groups are pushed to do bigger and bigger things in order to
get the
really,
attention they were looking for.
to make their message live in infamy to some degree.
Yeah. And it goes back to, like we were saying, like, so much is overshadowed by 9/11, and so much of what has happened is kind of forgotten to time, that it leads them to do even more crazier and insane stuff, and pushes. And I mean, and then again, you can't take out the fact that there was some reason for them doing that, and a lot of the reasoning could have been the U.S. going in and messing up their homes and
literally
whatever.
bombing them indiscriminately.
So let me see. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a very brief description of how we're kind of getting into the current day.
So when we think terrorism, or a terrorist to be very specific, we always think about how if someone is a terrorist, the framing around that is normally built that they are a threat to America and they need to be eliminated, to be very frank.
Yeah,
so,
at a very base level,
Yeah, because people don't normally think, let's give a terrorist a trial. They normally literally do not have that as an option.
No.
So what ends up happening is the United States will declare people enemy combatants, terrorists, whatever it may be. And that causes a shift in perception both in the media and among the people, that these people are no longer seen with the same level of human rights.
Yeah.
Because it is a war zone, and in a war zone, like, that type of thing might have to be suspended, which is kind of horrifying. Because based on Executive Order 13224, the Secretary of State, in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury and the Attorney General, may designate foreign individual or entities that he determines have committed or pose a significant risk of committing acts of terrorism that threaten the security of U.S. nationals or the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the U.S.
Economy of the U.S.
And that is how we currently classify terrorists, based off of that. And that is so ridiculously broad, it's not even funny. Because something can threaten the economy by being a threat to the oil fields. It can threaten the economy by possibly threatening American interests in a region.
Not even America itself.
And because they can make any foreign individual or entities, that's a big thing.
The entities?
Foreign individuals. Because right now we're focusing on foreign terrorism rather than domestic, to clarify. These people don't really have an option at all to
to dispute those claims at all.
It's literally, you are a terrorist, and now all of this comes with it. You're much less likely to get a trial by jury. You're more likely to get assassinated, because in reality, when people have this title, we think of Osama bin Laden.
That's the biggest one.
He was assassinated by, the CIA doing a vaccination drive in his town to get the DNA of his relatives to find him.
To link it to him,
Then what they did is, in the middle of the night, in foreign soil, we flew in and we assassinated them. We didn't even alert the government in fear they would find out.
And assassinated
then,
them.
rather than taking the man, doing a trial by jury in the United States, or extraditing him, we just killed him and threw him into the ocean. If that imagine in the U.S., if in the middle of the night, two Black Hawk helicopters flew into D.C., landed next to the White House, everybody ran in, they assassinated Mike Pence, flew out and said Mike Pence was a terrorist in our country, we would go to war immediately. If they did that to almost any American citizen. Now, obviously, I listed the vice president, which would automatically mean war, but if you're thinking a general, it could be so much as like
member. Really?
Freaking Anthony Fauci. Like, it could literally be anyone. And that's mind-blowing, because we very literally assassinated someone illegally on foreign soil against
warning, nothing
international
to that
law. And that really just points out that,
like, the hypocrisies kind of it all.
We don't give people those rights. And we also don't have a system for them to fight back against it.
We don't give them those rights, but we expect those rights to ourselves. I mean, and it goes back to, like we were saying, that quote you had with Noam Chomsky, where he talks about, like, looking the world over and seeing who would be classified as terrorists, or, like, what are the bad actors in that situation. And it's like, we're so egocentric that we just kind of, we praise those acts, and we think that was amazing, and that kind of, unified the country in some way, that assassination.
It really points to terrorism being a very two-sided coin here. The difference between a terrorist and a hero, or a martyr, whatever you may call it, is very thin, because it's just a matter of which side you're on, or for whom they did it for. And that is very scary, since a lot of our media, a lot of our state coverage, a lot of our state propaganda aimed towards us always puts ourselves as the hero. And we have to remember that at the same time, we are the exact opposite for other people.
And that's something, nobody ever really talks about or thinks about.
Because when we think of a place like Guantanamo Bay, where we arrested people and charged them for having specific watches that suicide bombers would use. A lot of those people, a good portion of them, we know are terrorists. No bullshit about it. There's a portion of them that we can't prove that they're terrorists, and then there's a portion that we just don't know. Like, just completely not 100%
could be a
sure.
random person, we're not sure,
And we can't bring these people to a trial by jury, even though they were captured, even though, we're there.
Whatever evidence there might be behind that.
Yeah, because finding evidence in a war zone is hard. I don't blame people for that.
Yeah.
If you're worried about dying, your first goal is not taking DNA samples.
No.
So, we have to reconcile with that as a country of whether or not we're okay with our ideals of freedom and liberty and everyone getting trial by jury, innocent until proven guilty. And then we are just slamming these people up for their entire lives.
We're just making a mockery of those things if you think about it. But then again, I mean, I don't know.
It's a hard position.
It is a really hard position to sit on, and I think a lot of people justify it by that. This kind of goes back to the torture episode, oh, these guys are bad actors. These guys are going to kill us. There's so many things that people can be told that they are. That whole, the blanket statement of what a terrorist is. That's just, that automatically means they're going to lose their rights. Or that automatically means, we should kill them, we should assassinate them, no questions asked. And, you saw it with, was it bin Soleimani?
Oh, yes! The Israeli, not the Israeli general. That was...
Is he Iraq?
I'm pretty sure he was an Iraqi general.
Yeah, he was an Iraqi general that we, almost a year ago, just... drone striked essentially at an airport, given and we put the label terrorist on it, and everybody just kind of oh, okay, he's a terrorist. They accepted it, no questions asked. Nobody thinking what did he really do? It was oh, he was actually fighting against ISIS that whole time. Or, oh, he was actually and again, it's a very high functioning member of that country's government was just assassinated by us. And you like you mentioned, if that had happened to us, it would be automatic retaliation, automatic war. And just somehow, luckily, nothing really happened out of that. But something very easily could have blown up, and that could have been
It really speaks
insane.
To the power the U.S. has, that we can get away with these actions.
All the stuff we get away with, yeah.
And, building on that a little bit, Chomsky says, in other words, we can distinguish 3 categories of crime: murder with intent, accidental killing, and murder with foreknowledge but without specific intent. Mm-hmm. Israeli and U.S. atrocities typically fall in the 3rd category. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about terrorism, to add even more ambiguity to it, you think was it done with intent? Think car bombing to assassinate someone. Okay. Was it accidental? The people who got caught up in that explosion. Yeah. Or was it murder with no foreknowledge, in the sense that you knew it would happen but didn't say anything? Mm-hmm.
That's the whole thing you were mentioning.
Yeah, we try to justify ourselves by saying that we're in the 3rd category. We might not have a specific intent to murder these. We never intended to hurt them. We might know about something. And that's how we try to frame a lot of our actions as the United States. And we also try to frame it as accidental killings. We were trying to assassinate the Iranian general, and anyone else who died in the explosion was just
collateral damage.
Oh,
it was just necessary to get the guy that... He was in this very one spot, very specific. Oh, we could get him here and be okay and not kill too many civilians.
Which is horrifying!
It's just that's how they justify those things. It's kind of insane.
This idea that it raises us from a level of moral depravity, that we're not doing it intentionally, or we're above
what they do,
is bullshit. Yeah. Because you're still murdering people, without a doubt. When you think U.S. airstrikes, what ends up happening is... Oh, sorry, drone strikes. Yeah. What ends up happening is they're murdering people who are our age, literally college-aged, 20 to 30-year-olds, that are then being classified as enemy combatants because of their age alone. We have, back in 2002, with a February press conference, Miss Clark and Admiral, Stufflebeam? It's an interesting name. Okay. Said... They don't know the identities of the individuals involved in these drone strikes. And when they were asked, are they convinced they're Taliban, their response is, we're convinced they're an appropriate target. We don't know exactly who they are. That is... So, this...
That just goes to show you, how... they indiscriminately just... These guys look like they could be the target, so they're the target. And they can, at the end of the day, say, oh, yeah... we don't know who they were or what they were doing, but we feel like they were an appropriate target. Like,
in that particular drone strike, it was done because they thought one of the 3 individuals was possibly bin Laden.
Oh my God.
Possibly.
And it definitely wasn't. I mean, obviously, given that.
Yeah, obviously based on our previous mention. But
Holy shit.
what I'm trying to bring up here is, like, there is no...
There's no oversight either.
Yeah.
Like, there's nobody, like, okaying or accepting this is what's happening. Like, it's just going on. And then, again, obviously, a lot of this is closed doors, or a lot of this is, like, it doesn't come out to the public.
Yeah,
or when it
we'll
does, it's
never
when
know.
something happens and it's effective, quote unquote. Like so many, like the big things. We don't really, again, it's all classified, a lot of this stuff. So we really don't know unless they come out and, like, in this case, hold a press conference and then answer these questions and horribly, try to describe how they, or justify what they did was right. Like,
and what blows my mind here is what we don't know. Yeah. How many drone strikes has this happened? How many people have been killed that we don't know about, that they can't even slightly justify, that never catch the news? If you guys have ever seen the congressional testimonies of a lot of Middle Easterners talking about how they fear the skies because of the drones we have in there, we undoubtedly have, like, caught our terrorists as in the United States. We do that. There's no if, there's no but. There is only more ambiguity of us trying to justify as hardliners. We're not as bad. We're not as terrible as these people who are doing this other type of terrorism.
Or we're doing it in retaliation. We're not doing it as a, to create a cause or to change something. Like, it goes back to kind of that, the differentiation between state-sponsored versus regular terrorism. And it's like, obviously this is state-sponsored. Obviously we're going into a foreign country outside of our reach, doing these things without their foreknowledge, in a way that we can somehow justify and say, oh, this was, an unintentional killing, or those deaths were unintentional. And it's just, we get away with it.
And at what point are they even terrorists? Because I feel like this gray area is so large about whether or not it's moral, whether or not they're actually, like, terrorists, in the sense that if they're in the right age, they count as enemy combatants. If they're in the right, like, area or location, then they're, like, casualties. Where, like, at what point is it actually terrorists? At what point is it actually people who are threatening the United States? Like, how far are we really taking this?
Like, where can't we go, I guess, is,
because,
like, the better question.
Should we really be drone striking people that are just a threat on the economics of the U.S., like, and will make less money?
Yeah.
Is it really, like, morally okay to even consider that? And it's building on itself over and over, pointing out that with the word terrorism, we're just not... We don't even understand, and we will never understand just how much we have killed, just how much we don't understand, just how broad this very specific term should be is just thrown out.
And just, basically whenever it fits the needs of us, whenever it fits the needs of, like, oh, this is justify this, and that's how they do it. I mean, it's crazy. And like you said, we won't even know how little we know. This stuff may never even come out. We might never get a real figure of, like, how many people have died from drone strikes, or how many drone strikes even have been conducted. I mean, these are things that people don't even think to ask. These are questions that they're beyond them, that it's just so open that, I don't know, so many people just think, well, it's not even worth talking about. It's not even worth arguing for.
Yeah, people don't even bring it up. Like, in the modern news... the 30-minute news, they're not exactly doing a segment like, we dropped 40,000 pounds of explosives in Syria today. That just doesn't happen.
Or the war in Afghanistan.
Because it's just so accepted.
Yeah.
And that blows my mind how willing we are to allow this type of thing. That we, as long as it is in that interest, and not trying to go too far into this, like, the level of propaganda that we have been given to accept that.
I was going to say, it's definitely a lot of justification on what terrorists are, who they are, how they can be defined, and then what are the rights that they have, or, like you said, what are the rights they don't have. And that's just the baseline of how people accept it.
Yeah, really, like, the conclusion of, at least for what I'm trying for this episode, is terrorism, terrorist, both of those terms are super subjective. They are very subjective based on where you are. They're morally vague. They can be manipulated. They have, in my opinion, failed as words.
I mean, yeah.
They have failed as terms. They're not being used properly. And because it is so dependent...
Or they are being used properly when necessary for the U.S. But.
Yeah, and because it is so dependent, because it acts as a cover to kill and assassinate people, as a way to just direct the public away, it's... like, is it even okay for us to use that anymore? Is it even okay for us to, like, walk away, like, with our hands not being just covered in blood here?
I mean, I don't know. I think it's been okay in the past. I know what you're saying, and I think, it fits kind of well with something that I found and was just mulling over. Where can I find it? Essentially, it was saying that, let me see where it is. The word, so this is a quote kind of from somebody I had found. Let me see. The name of the book was Terrorism, Terrorists by Charles Tilly.
Oh, yes. To properly reference Noam Chomsky, my quotes were from Who Rules the World?
Yeah. William's
very interesting read.
Very interested in that book. Anyways, this guy kind of pointed out that the word terror points to a widely recurrent but imprecisely bounded political strategy. So it's...
would you mind saying it one more time for me?
Yeah. The word terror points to a widely recurrent but imprecisely bounded political strategy. So I take that to mean that, we have so focused on one group as being called terrorists, or as this one type of people as being terrorists, that we don't look at the, whole range of the spectrum of what actually terrorists are. And like this whole episode essentially of us trying to understand more about, who is a terrorist or how can they be labeled as such, and then again, what impacts does that have on them? And like that kind of is to your point of it's such a huge definition. It's so broad. It's like we need to understand just first just say, this is huge. We need to, kind of tone back and really take a look at how this got here and why we think this way. And I don't think too many people are really willing to do that. But I mean, I agree completely, and I think that quote really fits well with what you're saying.
That quote's almost a perfect summary. I'm almost disappointed I didn't find it.
There's more. I mean, I'll show you this.